Welcome to Voodoo Whiskey Gaming, and this is my late review of Assassin's Creed Valhalla. I played it on the Xbox Series X. It's also available on the PS5, PS4, Xbox One, and Stadia. So let's get into the story. You play as Eivor, a young female or male Viking warrior. And in what is essentially the prologue, I mean before really even anything kicks off, you and your brother basically decide that your father's a moron and he is no longer what is best for the tribe, but rather than overthrow him, you leave. You leave to England to discover what's going on there, basically set up for yourselves, set up your own community, as well as chase down a secret order. Because your brother, while he was out traveling, met a couple of, well, they're assassins. They don't call them assassins, but they're very, very clearly assassins. So your tale is one of growing this community, conquering this portion of England, as well as discovering this secret organization, and they actually do a really good job with the story. I was really pleased with a lot of the characters, and whenever I thought I knew where the story was going, admittedly there were a few story beats I anticipated, but then there was something that I just didn't see coming at all, which is something I really appreciate. That's always good. It's good to keep your viewers guessing, and I really just enjoyed that element. Overall, I really like the story. I've been a fan of the Assassin's Creed stories for a while. I will say some of them have been weaker than others, but this is not among those in my opinion. Now let's get into the audio, and I will register my complaint, and my very first and really only complaint, and it's not constant, is every now and then the sound effects will disappear. Like, you'll just be walking in an area and suddenly there's no sound effects. And it's not all the sound effects, but like footsteps will just vanish even though they were there literally a second ago, and it's just kind of weird and it does throw you off for a moment. As for the rest of the sound effects, I think they're very good. I really love the ambient noises. I think they do a great job when you're out in nature, when you're out in the countryside, or when you're in a battle. The ambient sounds of battle, I think all of that does a great job to suck you into the moment, even if that moment is a calm, serene ride through the countryside. As for the music, I think it's very good. I really do enjoy it. I think they always do a good job. And then, of course, there's the voiceover work, which the majority of it is very good, and maybe it's just me, and maybe it's just some of the accents, but some of the voiceover work doesn't sound quite as good, and it's never the major characters. But there are a few people, like merchants, that you interact with pretty frequently who could sound a bit better. And like I said, maybe it's the accents that's throwing me off, but it also doesn't always sound like good delivery. But let's get into the gameplay mechanics and whatnot, and Assassin's Creed Valhalla really kind of follows what the last couple of Assassin's Creed, well, all the Assassin's Creed games have done. It's a third-person, open-world action game. And like the last two, this one definitely has RPG elements. In fact, this one has like this kind of constellation skill tree set up, which is actually kind of cool. Or not skill tree, but leveling tree kind of thing. But there are also abilities that you gain, and if you find like 2 books on them or whatever, they will level up and become more powerful. And I know I mentioned this in Watch Dogs Legions, and I will mention it again here because it does actually apply. I felt like Valhalla was a much more accessible game than, say, Odyssey or Origins. While the map is large, it's not so huge and so intimidating, and I think there's a lot more to do in this, but I won't say that it felt overwhelming. There was no point in time when I picked up my controller and went, oh god, where do I even begin? But let's get into it. There's a lot of combat, there's a lot of travel, there's a lot of missions and side missions, and I think they did a good job balancing all of those things. I will say I wasn't necessarily as happy in the beginning with how the combat felt. It doesn't feel exactly like you are expecting it to, and once you get the hang of it, it's better, but I wasn't in love with it. This is not my favorite combat system in an Assassin's Creed game. Not that it's wildly different from Odyssey, it just doesn't feel quite as clean at first, but once you get the hang of it, the small subtle differences, it does start to get better. The one thing I will say, and they made a really big deal about it, is your ability to get all these weapons and equip whatever. Yes, that is there, but finding a lot of these weapons and getting a really good variety is not so much there. I mean, it took me a very long time to get away from axes and get to a sword, which I really enjoyed the sword, but I still have only found 1 spear. There's like 50 shields that I have, though. So I was a little disappointed with that. I think they could have given you better access to some weapons to begin with. Like any Assassin's Creed game, there is climbing to be done, and that exploration. I will say, I think this has been common in the past few, the climbing isn't as good as it could be. I think it was actually several games ago that they hit the best system for that, and it was partially controls, but it was also just the system worked best, and they've gone away from it, and it's not terrible, but there are definitely times I found myself stuck when I shouldn't have been. And I want to come back to it real quick though. I will say that once you get the hang of a certain weapon, once you start understanding the combat system, it does become more satisfying. But another complaint I have is with the automation of the horse in this game, you know what I mean, where it will take you to your next waypoint. I don't think it works well in this game because you'll be, say, 100 meters from a road, and if you hold down the X button to follow the nearest road, it will take you there, but the second you hit the Y button to take you to your destination, it'll say no, it can't do that. But then once you've reached the road and hit the Y button again, it'll be like, oh yeah, I'll take you there, no problem. Which just makes no sense and is frustrating, and that's obviously not a control issue, but the other issue is that it'll take you on the least direct route. Like, you'll reach a road and your point is to the north and the road goes north or south, and it will take you south and take you around the entire island back to that point unless you do some manual work to then get yourself going in the right direction at first. It sounds stupid, but it does get frustrating after a while. Like any Assassin's Creed game though, there are plenty of collectibles, and I actually thought that they did a good job with those because it's a lot of gear, so it's actually useful stuff that you're going and collecting. Rather than, collect 257 feathers or whatever it was from Assassin's Creed 2, and then you got, it was useful, but it wasn't that useful. Oh wait, no, it wasn't even useful. It was the cape that got you punched in the face, immediately. So you don't run into that. A lot of the collectibles are treasure that you can use to buy stuff, to upgrade your encampment, I'm gonna say, I know I've leveled some complaints, but I will say that while playing it, I really did begin to really enjoy the experience, the traveling, the combat, the finding all the different things, hunting down members of the orders, doing the side missions. I think that all actually was really well balanced, and therefore very functional and enjoyable. Now let's get into the controls, which I gotta say, I think the controls work well. Like I said, some of their functions in the game don't necessarily work great, like the climbing, but the responsiveness and the actual usability of the controls I think is phenomenal. I think they're well mapped out, they do what you want when you want them to do it, and even sometimes you'll be able to interrupt your own movement already to dodge or attack. Now let's get into the visuals, and the first thing I'm gonna say is I ran into a lot of weird little visual glitches and a couple of things that didn't impress me. So let's get into the two things that didn't impress me. First off, people's hair. It looks ridiculous. Most of it looks pretty shit considering how far along we are past shitty looking hair in video games. And then the fire effect. It always looks like it's hovering. It doesn't look real. It doesn't look like it's necessarily part of the world. I wish that looked better. I could have been more impressed with that. As for the weird visual glitches I ran into, there were times where I was on a hill or something and I would kill an animal and it would just start sliding down the hill before I could loot it, and that was frustrating. Then you also had the fact that I ran into an NPC who just started spinning, like pirouette style. It was kind of interesting, but still, they weren't supposed to be doing that, so it was a little weird. And lastly, there was a time where I was doing a stealth kill, and the motions just switched. Like, for a second, it was the enemy stealth attacking me. It was weird. It was a weird, character model switch. That being said, all the negatives being set aside, I do think it's actually a good looking game. The skin of the characters looks phenomenal, as weird as that is, but it's an important key detail. As well as the scars on their faces. I think that's all very well done. I was really impressed with the level of detail there. I was actually more impressed with the detail in the furs that they were wearing than in their hair, which is weird, but it does add a depth to their garb, which is important, I think. I thought it was neat that when you are using different weapons, you do have somewhat different fighting styles, and it's a visual thing that you do notice. I think that's cool. I think the animals in this game look good. I think the landscape looks really good. I think it's beautiful. Even when you're in Norway, it's beautiful. When you are in England, it's beautiful. It's even more beautiful because it's a lot more varied. The landscapes there are more varied. There are some neat subtle details your characters will do with the boats when they're piloting the boats, when you're traveling. It's just a cool thing. And then a subtle detail I noticed, and I don't know if it's been in other games, but I really noticed it here, was the cloud effects. How weird that may be, but clouds in the sky will actually affect the lighting. If they're blocking the sun or the moon, it will become darker. Once they're no longer blocking the sun or the moon, it will become brighter, which is just a really, really impressive, subtle detail. I was really blown away by it. So let's get into the wrap-up, and I'm gonna say at first I really wasn't that into the game. Like the prologue mostly, I wasn't too into it, but as I kept going and the story was really growing, I got more and more into it, and I really started to enjoy the story. I started to enjoy the world more and more the more I was in it. And by the time I got here to reviewing it, I gotta say I really enjoyed it. I liked it a lot more than some of the more recent Assassin's Creed endeavors. I mean, yes, there are some problems with it, but the game itself, the overall, is good enough to overlook those. So I'm gonna say I fully recommend this. I will say this is one of my favorite Assassin's Creed in recent years. Okay, so in the comments down below, why don't you tell me what's your favorite era that Assassin's Creed has gone to so far? And as always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button. And if you like what I'm doing in general, share, subscribe. Have a good one.